Imagine, just for a moment, that you are floating. You are in a small, quiet room, a place of soft hums from fans and electronics. You drift over to a special window, not just a simple pane of glass, but a thick, multi-layered cupola, a bubble of crystal-clear quartz and fused silica, and you look out. Below you, in an impossible, silent, and overwhelming display of majesty, is the entire planet Earth. You are in orbit. You are weightless, and the view is, without question, the most beautiful and profound thing you have ever seen. You see the deep, impossible blue of the Pacific Ocean, a single vast entity that dominates the view, so blue it feels like you could fall into it forever. You can see the swirling, brilliant white patterns of clouds, as delicate and intricate as brushstrokes, marching in a slow-motion parade across the continents. You pass over the sun-scorched ochre and tan deserts of Australia, their ancient redness stark against the blue of the sea. A little later, you glide over the deep emerald green of the Amazon rainforest, a living, breathing carpet of life so vast it seems to have its own weather systems. Night falls not as a slow, gentle fade like it does on the ground, but as a sharp, clean, and surprisingly fast line. This line, the terminator, is the hard edge between day and night, and it sweeps across the globe beneath you with silent geometric precision. And as it does, the continents below you transform. They become a glittering golden web of city lights, a beautiful, intricate map of human presence tracing the coastlines and river valleys. It's a stunning, silent testament to the 7 billion souls living on that sphere below. It's a view of home, whole and complete.
Then, as your orbit carries you high over the polar regions, you see the most ethereal and magical sight of all, the aurora. Ghostly, silent curtains of green, purple, and sometimes red light dance and shimmer in the highest reaches of the atmosphere. They are not like earthly lights. They are alive. They ripple and flow like vast, translucent ribbons being waved in a slow cosmic breeze. This is the beautiful, visible evidence of our planet's magnetic shield protecting us from the sun's constant stream of particles. There is no sound up here. There is no real sense of speed, even though you are hurtling through the vacuum at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour. There is only the silent, overwhelming, and deeply peaceful beauty of our world, turning slowly, patiently, and perfectly below you. It's a cosmic clockwork, a predictable and reassuring dance of orbits and rotations. But what happens when that clockwork breaks? What happens when the perfect, predictable dance is interrupted, and the clear, simple path back to that beautiful blue marble below you suddenly vanishes? Tonight, we're going to explore those rare, quiet, and incredible moments in the history of space exploration. These are the stories of astronauts and cosmonauts who, through a sudden mechanical failure, a political upheaval, or even just a string of bad luck, found themselves adrift, stranded in the vast, silent wilderness of space. But this isn't a story of disaster. This is a story of quiet courage. It's a story of brilliant minds on the ground and in space, working together against impossible odds to solve unsolvable problems. These are tales of human resilience, where the goal isn't to sensationalize the danger, but to appreciate the incredible ingenuity and the deep, unshakable calm it took to bring everyone home. So, let's settle in and begin our journey.
Our first story, and in many ways the longest and most surreal, is not about a broken machine, but a broken country. It's the story of a man who was stranded in orbit not by a mechanical failure, but by the collapse of a superpower. He was a cosmonaut who launched from one nation and was forced to wait in space until a new one was ready to bring him home. This is the quiet, incredible story of Sergei Krikalev, often called the last citizen of the USSR. To truly appreciate his story, we have to first understand his home in the sky, the Mir space station. Mir, whose name means both peace and world in Russian, was a marvel of Soviet engineering and endurance. It was not launched as a single piece like America's Skylab. Instead, it was a modular station, a kind of orbital tinker toy set. The first piece, the core module, was launched in 1986. Over the next 10 years, other large modules, like the Kvant 1 and Kvant 2 science labs, and the Crystal docking and technology module, were launched one by one and attached to the core, creating a sprawling, slightly chaotic, and uniquely Russian outpost in space. Mir had a reputation for being cramped, cluttered, and a bit like a well-worn, slightly messy workshop. Wires and cables were often bundled and zip-tied along the walls, but it was also incredibly robust and resilient. It was a place where cosmonauts learned to be not just scientists, but orbital mechanics, plumbers, and electricians, constantly performing repairs and upgrades to keep their home running. Life on Mir was a constant hum of fans, pumps, and electronics, the sounds of a machine breathing around you. It was a testament to the Soviet philosophy of building rugged, repairable systems designed to last. And it was here that Sergei Krikalev found himself living when the world he knew disappeared. In May of 1991, Sergei Krikalev launched on a Soyuz rocket from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. This historic launch pad, from which Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin had begun the space age, was located in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, a constituent part of the vast Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Krikalev was a highly experienced and respected flight engineer. This was already his second long-duration spaceflight. His mission was planned to be a standard tour of duty, lasting about 5 months, during which he would perform a series of spacewalks and scientific experiments. He was a citizen of the Soviet Union, launched on a Soviet rocket from a Soviet spaceport to live and work on the Soviet space station, Mir. Everything was, seemingly, as it should be. For the first few months of the mission, life aboard Mir was routine, a predictable rhythm of work, exercise, and communication with mission control, or TSUP, located in a suburb of Moscow. Krikalev and his crewmate, Anatoly Artsebarsky, along with the British astronaut Helen Sharman, who had flown up with them for a short visit, settled into their tasks. They tended to experiments in material science and biology. They maintained the station's sometimes finicky systems, and they looked out the window at the silent, beautiful Earth below. But the news they received from the ground, through regular radio uplinks and messages from their families, grew increasingly strange and tense throughout that summer. The Soviet Union, which had for decades seemed like a monolithic and unchangeable global power, was showing signs of deep and rapid fragmentation. Krikalev, floating in the quiet peace of orbit, was a distant spectator to the beginnings of a political earthquake on the ground. In August of 1991, just 3 months into his mission, that earthquake would strike with full force. He would hear the news of a failed coup in Moscow.
Hardline members of the Communist Party had attempted to overthrow the reformist Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev. For 3 days, the world held its breath as tanks rolled through the streets of Moscow. The coup ultimately failed, largely thanks to the defiance of Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic. But the event fatally wounded the authority of the Central Soviet government. From his vantage point in space, Krikalev could only listen to the fragmented news reports and wonder about the safety of his family and the future of his country. The failed coup accelerated the process of dissolution. One by one, the constituent republics of the Soviet Union began to declare their independence. The powerful, centralized state was breaking apart. For Krikalev, this had very real and personal consequences. His planned 5-month mission was supposed to end in October 1991. A new crew was scheduled to launch and replace him. But the space program, which had always been a source of immense national pride, was now in a state of chaos and financial ruin. The new fiscally strapped government of what was now effectively Russia couldn't afford to just launch a fresh crew. They needed money. They had already sold seats on upcoming Soyuz flights to other nations, like Austria and the newly independent Kazakhstan, which was now demanding a Kazakh cosmonaut be flown as part of the agreement for Russia to continue using the Baikonur Cosmodrome. The mission plans were in constant flux. The bottom line was, they didn't have a trained flight engineer ready to take Krikalev's place, and they couldn't afford to send up an empty rocket to bring him home. So Mission Control asked him to stay. They explained the situation and requested that he extend his mission, to remain on Mir as its caretaker until they could sort things out. It was a request born of desperation. Krikalev, a dedicated professional and patriot, understood the situation. He agreed. He would wait.
The weeks turned into months. October passed, the scheduled end of his mission. The autumn of 1991 bled into winter. High above the earth, Sergei Krikalev continued his daily routine. He maintained the station's systems, he performed what scientific experiments he could, and he exercised on the station's treadmill and stationary bike, trying to fight off the relentless physical decay of microgravity. His muscles were atrophying, his bones were losing calcium, and his immune system was weakening, all normal for long-duration spaceflight, but his flight was now stretching far beyond normal. The psychological strain was immense. He was a man in limbo, watching the world he knew, the country he had sworn an oath to, literally vanish from the map beneath him. His hometown of Leningrad, a city that had held that name for nearly 70 years, was renamed St. Petersburg in a vote while he was in orbit. The currency of his country, the ruble, was experiencing hyperinflation, making his cosmonaut salary, which was still being deposited in a bank back on Earth, nearly worthless. He was, in every sense, adrift. His only connection to this rapidly changing world was the intermittent voice of mission control. He would ask for news of his family and of the political situation. They would do their best to keep him informed, but even they were often unsure of what was happening. Then, on Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. The next day, December 26th, the Soviet Union was formally and officially dissolved. Sergei Krikalev was now quite literally a man without a country. He was the last citizen of the USSR, watching the world from above, waiting for a new nation, Russia, to find a way to bring him home.
His long, lonely vigil continued into the new year, 1992. The Russian space agency, Roscosmos, was struggling to find its footing and its funding. At one point, there were serious discussions about selling off the Mir space station itself to try and raise money. For Krikalev, the uncertainty was the hardest part. He didn't know if his mission would last another week, another month, or another year. He just had to keep the station running and trust that the people on the ground had not forgotten him. Finally, a deal was struck. The nation of Germany paid the fledgling Russian space agency about $24 million to send a German astronaut, Klaus Dietrich Flade, up to Mir, along with a Russian commander to finally relieve Krikalev. In March of 1992, a Soyuz spacecraft at last arrived with the replacement crew. After 311 consecutive days in orbit, nearly 11 months, almost double the length of his originally planned mission, Sergei Krikalev was finally going home. His return to Earth was just as surreal as his time in orbit. The Soyuz capsule descended under its parachute onto the vast snowy steppe of Kazakhstan. But this was no longer a part of his home country. It was now an independent nation. When the rescue crews opened the hatch and helped him out of the capsule, he was pale, weak, and dizzy. His body had to readjust to the crushing force of gravity. As he stood unsteadily on the ground, someone handed him a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, a small traditional welcome back to Earth. One of the first things he reportedly asked for was a lemon, a simple, earthly taste he had been craving. Another person held up the new tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. The red banner with the hammer and sickle that had been on his uniform when he left was gone, replaced by a new symbol for a new country. He was a hero of the Soviet Union who had returned to a nation called Russia.
Sergei Krikalev's story is a quiet epic. It's a story of profound personal resilience and professionalism, set against the backdrop of one of the 20th century's greatest political upheavals. He was not stranded by a technical failure, but by the slow, inexorable march of history on the ground below. He became an accidental symbol of the end of an era, a man who literally watched his world change from the most distant vantage point imaginable. His long vigil is a powerful, quiet testament to the human ability to endure, to adapt, and to simply keep doing the job, even when the ground has shifted completely beneath your feet. Now, let's leave this story of a man stranded by history and turn to a story of a crew stranded by a sudden, violent mechanical failure. We're going to travel back in time a little further to the golden age of space exploration, the Apollo program, for a mission that is perhaps the most famous survival story of all time. We're going to tell the quiet, problem-solving story of Apollo 13. It's often called a successful failure, and I think that's the perfect way to describe it. The mission failed completely in its primary objective, which was to land on the moon for the third time. But it succeeded spectacularly in its most fundamental objective, to bring the astronauts home safely to the Earth. In many ways, it's not a story of failure at all. It's the story of NASA's finest hour, a shining example of grace under pressure and brilliant ingenuity. The mission began in April of 1970. The crew was commanded by the veteran astronaut Jim Lovell. This was to be his fourth spaceflight and his second trip to the moon after having orbited it on Apollo 8. He was one of the most experienced astronauts in the Corps.
His crewmates were Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, and Jack Swigert, the command module pilot. The crew roster itself was the result of a last-minute drama. Originally, an astronaut named Ken Mattingly was slated to be the command module pilot. But just a few days before the launch, the backup crew was exposed to the German measles. Mattingly, it turned out, was the only one of the prime crew who had never had the disease and had no immunity. The flight surgeons, worried that he might get sick during the mission, made the difficult decision to ground him. Jack Swigert, his backup, was slotted in at the last minute, with only 2 days to prepare for the flight of his life. It was a small, strange twist of fate that would have enormous consequences. The launch on April 11, 1970, aboard their colossal Saturn V rocket was nearly perfect. There was one small, early shutdown of an engine on the second stage, but the rocket's guidance system compensated perfectly, and they made it to orbit without any major issues. The first 2 days of their journey to the moon were, as Jim Lovell later described them, the smoothest and most routine flight he had ever been on. They held a television broadcast showing the viewers back on Earth what life was like inside their connected command module, Odyssey, and their lunar module, Aquarius. The crew was relaxed and in good spirits. Then, about 56 hours into the mission, when they were over 300,000 kilometers from home, a routine request came up from Mission Control in Houston. They asked the crew to perform a standard procedure to turn on the stirring fans inside their cryogenic oxygen tanks. These tanks, located in the service module, contained the spacecraft's supply of liquid oxygen. The oxygen wasn't just for breathing, it was also combined with liquid hydrogen in the ship's fuel cells to generate all of their electricity and water.
Stirring the tanks was necessary to get an accurate quantity reading. Jack Swigert flicked the switch for the cryostir. A moment later, the crew felt a dull but solid bang reverberate through the spacecraft. On the control panel, a master alarm light flashed red, and one of the main electrical systems suddenly went dead. The astronauts were startled and confused. Their first thought was that perhaps the fragile lunar module had been struck by a micrometeoroid. It was Jack Swigert who made the now famous understated call down to Houston. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Commander Jim Lovell came on a moment later. "Houston, we've had a problem," he repeated. "We've had a main B-bus undervolt. Down in mission control, the flight controllers saw the strange, confusing readings on their screens. They saw a momentary power failure, but then the system seemed to come back online. Like the astronauts, they were initially baffled. No one could have possibly imagined the catastrophic event that had just taken place. Silently, in the vacuum of space, what had actually happened was a hidden failure, a problem that had been silently waiting for them since before they even left the ground. Years earlier, the oxygen tank, Tank 2, had accidentally dropped during ground testing. This likely damaged a small tube inside. Later, during a pre-flight test on the launch pad, a faulty thermostat on a heater inside the tank had allowed the temperature to rise far higher than it should have, which damaged the Teflon insulation on the wiring for the stirring fan. A hidden bomb had been created. When Swigert flicked that switch, the damaged wiring created a spark. In a tank filled with pure high-pressure oxygen, that spark was all it took. The tank exploded. The explosion of Oxygen Tank 2 was violent. It didn't just rupture the tank, it blew a large panel clean off the side of the service module, that big cylindrical section behind the crew's capsule. The blast also severely damaged the plumbing and valves connected to the adjacent Oxygen Tank 1, which now also began to leak its precious contents out into the blackness of space. The astronauts couldn't see any of this damage. From inside their capsule, all they knew was what their instruments were telling them, and the instruments were painting a confusing and terrifying picture. Alarms were going off. Voltage on their main electrical systems was fluctuating wildly. And then Jim Lovell happened to glance out one of the side windows. What he saw made his blood run cold. "Houston," he reported, his voice still remarkably steady, "we are venting something out into space." He saw a cloud of gas, a shimmering, venting plume, escaping from the side of their ship. Mission Control asked him what he was seeing. "It's a gas of some sort," he repeated. At first, everyone hoped it might be water or helium, but then, both on the ground and in the capsule, all eyes went to the single most critical set of gauges, the quantity readings for their two main oxygen tanks. The needle for Tank 2 was flat on 0. It was gone. And the needle for Tank 1 was dropping. Steadily, relentlessly, it was heading towards empty. In that moment,
the confusion evaporated and was replaced by a stark, chilling clarity. This wasn't a minor electrical glitch. This was a complete catastrophe. Their oxygen wasn't just for breathing, it was the reactant for the fuel cells that generated all of their electricity and water. With the oxygen gone, their command module, the Odyssey, was dying. The mission to land on the moon was over. This was now a mission of pure survival.
Down in Mission Control in Houston, the team, led by the legendary flight director Gene Kranz, quickly came to the same conclusion. The command module was a dead ship. It had some emergency batteries, but those held just enough power for the final few hours of the mission to guide the capsule through re-entry. They could not be used now. To survive the 4-day journey back to Earth, the crew would have to use the lunar module Aquarius as a lifeboat. This was an idea that had been considered in contingency plans, but it had never been practiced in a simulation. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort. The lunar module was designed to support 2 men for about 2 days on the surface of the moon. Now, it would have to keep 3 men alive for 4 long days in deep space. Its batteries were not designed for this. Its oxygen supply was not designed for this. Its water supply was not designed for this. And critically, its carbon dioxide scrubbers were not designed for this. The first critical step was to get the crew into the lunar module and get it powered up before the command module died completely. This had to be done quickly. But they couldn't just abandon the Odyssey's computer. The guidance system in the command module knew exactly where they were and which way they were pointing. The lunar module's computer was cold and dark. It had no idea. The crew had to perform a procedure that had been written just a few weeks before the mission, a way to manually transfer the guidance alignment from one computer to the other. Under immense pressure, they scribbled down the numbers from the Odyssey's display and manually punched them into the Aquarius's computer. It was a frantic but precise race against time. They managed to get it done just as the last of the Odyssey's fuel cells died. The main ship went completely dark and cold.
For the next 4 days, the 3 astronauts lived in the cramped, cold, and dark confines of the lunar module. The word lifeboat is accurate. It was a rough, uncomfortable, and precarious ride. The LM, to save weight, had very little insulation. With most of its systems powered down to conserve precious battery life, the cabin heaters were off. The temperature inside the cabin began to plummet, dropping to just a few degrees above freezing. Condensation formed on all the walls and equipment, and the astronauts were constantly damp and chilled. Sleep was almost impossible. Huddled together in the freezing cold, trying to get a few moments of rest while grappling with their uncertain fate. Water was another critical issue. To conserve the lunar module's limited supply, the crew had to ration their drinking water severely. They were restricted to just a few ounces per day each. Dehydration became a serious problem, leading to exhaustion and impairing their ability to think clearly. They also had to ration their food, as they only had the LM's supply available. But the most immediate and life-threatening problem they faced was not the cold or the lack of water. It was the air they were breathing. As humans, we exhale carbon dioxide. In a tiny sealed cabin, that CO2 will quickly build up to toxic levels, leading to headaches, confusion, and eventually death. Both the command module and the lunar module had systems to remove this CO2 from the air. These systems worked by passing the cabin air through canisters filled with a chemical called lithium hydroxide, which absorbs the CO2. The problem was one of simple geometry. The command module system used round canisters. The lunar module system used square canisters, and they were running out of square canisters fast. The crew had plenty of fresh, unused round canisters in the dead command module, but they had no way to make them fit into the square opening in the lunar module's life support system. It was a classic square peg in a round hole problem on which their lives depended. Back in Houston, the engineers in Mission Control were tasked with inventing a solution using only the materials they knew the astronauts had access to them on board. The scene in Mission Control was one of quiet, focused intensity. A team of engineers dumped a replica of every single item the astronauts had access to onto a table. This included things like the plastic covers from their flight manuals, storage bags, duct tape, famously lots of duct tape, and even a pair of socks. They were given a simple, almost impossible task. You have to find a way to put a round filter into a square hole using only this. For hours, these brilliant minds worked, cutting, taping, and fitting pieces together. They were, in essence, inventing a new piece of hardware on the fly. Finally, they had a design that they thought would work. It was an ungainly, strange-looking contraption, a jumble of cardboard, plastic, and gray duct tape that they nicknamed the mailbox because of its shape. The next step was one of the most remarkable conversations in the history of spaceflight. Over the crackling radio, a controller in Houston had to slowly and calmly read the step-by-step instructions for how to build this strange device up to the exhausted, dehydrated astronauts 300,000 kilometers away in their freezing lifeboat. The crew followed the instructions perfectly. They built their filter, fitted it into place, and sealed it with duct tape. And then they held their breath. It worked. The carbon dioxide levels in the cabin, which had been climbing to dangerous levels, began to drop. It was a triumph of pure, unglamorous, hands-on ingenuity. With the CO2 problem solved, there were still other immense hurdles to overcome on their long, looping journey around the moon and back to Earth. The spacecraft was now on what was called a free return trajectory, meaning that the moon's gravity would naturally sling them back towards home without needing a major engine burn. But their path was not perfect. It was a little too shallow, meaning if they didn't correct it, they would glance off the edge of Earth's atmosphere and skip back out into space, with no chance of return.
They needed to perform a critical course correction burn using the lunar module's descent engine, the same engine that was meant to land them on the moon. But to do that, they needed to know exactly which way their strange, lopsided spacecraft was pointing. Normally, this alignment was done using the ship's sophisticated computer and a device called a star tracker. But the main computer in the command module was off, and the explosion had created a cloud of glittering, sunlit debris that was still traveling with them. This cloud of debris confused the lunar module's star tracker, making it impossible to get a lock on the guide stars. So they had to perform the alignment manually. It was an incredible feat of old-fashioned celestial navigation. Jim Lovell had to use the ship's small optical sight, a kind of space-age sextant, to find the one star he could reliably see and identify, our own sun. He had to keep the sun perfectly centered in the crosshairs of his window, while Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert, using handwritten calculations passed up from the ground, carefully fired the small reaction control thrusters to orient their strange, crippled craft. It was pure piloting by the seat of their pants, a delicate and precise maneuver performed while exhausted, cold, and dehydrated. They nailed it. The engine burn was perfect, putting them on the right path for home.
Finally, after 4 long, cold, and incredibly stressful days, the blue and white marble of Earth loomed large in their window. It was time for the final, most dangerous act. The crew had to leave the relative safety of their lifeboat, the Aquarius, and move back into the dead, frozen command module, Odyssey. They had to somehow bring it back to life using only its precious, limited battery power. The process was tense. They followed a long, complex checklist of procedures that had been written on the fly by the engineers in Houston. They powered up one system at a time, hoping that the long, deep freeze hadn't caused any permanent damage to the electronics. Miraculously, everything worked. The computers came back online. The guidance system initialized. The Odyssey was alive again. They then said goodbye to their faithful lifeboat. The lunar module Aquarius had saved their lives. It was designed for a one-way trip down to the moon, but instead it had served as their home, their engine, and their salvation. They sealed it off and jettisoned it, sending it to burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. They were now alone in the command module, ready for the fiery ride home. The re-entry was the final great unknown. No one was entirely sure if the heat shield on the bottom of the capsule had been damaged in the initial explosion. And because they had to ration power so severely, there was concern that condensation and ice might have formed inside the mechanisms that deployed the parachutes. As they hit the atmosphere at nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, the world held its breath. The radio blackout was longer than usual, adding to the tension. But then the signal came through. The parachutes opened perfectly, and the capsule splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean, right on target. The crew of Apollo 13 was home.
The story of Apollo 13 is so famous for a reason. It perfectly captures the ethos of NASA's mission control, often summarized by Flight Director Gene Kranz's motto, "Failure is not an option." It was a story where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, And yet, through a combination of brilliant engineering on the ground and incredible courage and skill in the sky, they turned a certain disaster into a triumphant recovery. It is a quiet, powerful testament to the human ability to solve impossible problems under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Now, let's leave the deep space drama of the Apollo program and travel to a different time and place in our story. We're going to explore a mission where the greatest danger wasn't in space at all, but in the final, brutal moments of returning to Earth. This is a lesser known, but in its own way, equally harrowing tale of survival. Our story takes us to the Soviet Union in October of 1976. The Cold War is still very much a reality, and the space race continues, though now focused on long-duration space stations rather than the moon. The mission was Soyuz 23. Two cosmonauts, Vyacheslav Zudov and Valery Rozdeshvensky, were launched into orbit. Their goal was to dock with the Salyut 5 military space station, a small orbital outpost that was part of a secret Soviet program. The mission, however, went wrong almost as soon as they approached the station. The Soyuz spacecraft was equipped with an automated docking system called Igla, which means needle in Russian. It was a complex system of radar antennas and thrusters designed to hunt down the space station and perform a perfect automated docking. But on this mission, the Igla system malfunctioned.
The Igla system was supposed to be reliable, but on this approach, its sensors gave faulty readings. The spacecraft's computer thought it was not properly aligned with the space station, even though it was. It began to fire the small maneuvering thrusters automatically, trying to correct a problem that didn't exist. The cosmonauts inside felt their capsule lurching and jerking unexpectedly. They tried to take manual control to override the faulty system, but the Igla was burning through their precious maneuvering fuel at an alarming rate. Down at the Soviet mission control, the flight controllers saw the erratic movements and the rapidly depleting fuel gauges. A safe, controlled manual docking would be extremely difficult and risky with so little fuel remaining. A small miscalculation could lead to a collision with the space station or leave them stranded in orbit with no way to get home. After a tense discussion, the decision was made. The mission had to be aborted. After only 2 days in orbit, having never even reached their destination, the crew of Soyuz 23 was ordered to come home. It was a deeply frustrating and disappointing end to their mission, but everyone assumed the most dangerous part was over. The real terror, however, was just beginning. Because their mission was cut so short and they were on a different orbital path than planned, their landing was going to be what's known as a ballistic re-entry. This is a steeper, less controlled descent trajectory that subjects the crew to much higher gravitational forces, or G-forces, than a normal landing. It's a rougher ride, but a standard backup procedure. What wasn't standard, however, was the weather. A massive and severe blizzard was raging across the prime landing zone on the flat, open plains or steppe of Kazakhstan. High winds, heavy snow, and frigid sub-zero temperatures had blanketed the entire region.
The descent was rough, as expected. The Soyuz capsule, encased in a fireball of plasma, plunged through the atmosphere.
The parachutes deployed, but the high winds of the blizzard immediately began to push the capsule far off its intended course. The landing was going to be completely blind, not just for the crew inside, but for the recovery teams on the ground. At night, in the middle of the raging snowstorm, the Soyuz 23 capsule finally slammed down to Earth. But it didn't land on the solid, snowy ground of the steppe. It crashed through a thick layer of ice and plunged into the freezing, salty water of a huge body of water called Lake Tengiz. The capsule had missed its landing zone by over 120 kilometers. The situation inside was instantly dire. The main parachute, now soaked with icy water, acted like a giant sea anchor, dragging the capsule onto its side and then upside down, completely submerging the main exit hatch. The impact with the water caused the electrical systems to short out. The lights went out, the radio went silent, the heaters stopped working. The two cosmonauts, Vyacheslav Zudov and Valery Rojdestvensky, were trapped. They were inside a tiny metal sphere, upside down, in the middle of a freezing lake in the dead of night during a violent blizzard, hundreds of miles from anyone who could help. Their ordeal was just beginning. The outside temperature was a brutal -22 degrees Celsius. The thin metal walls of the capsule offered little insulation, and the interior temperature began to plummet. Condensation from their own breath started to freeze in glittering sheets on the inside of the capsule. To survive the cold, they had to strip off their now useless bulky pressure suits and put on their warm woolen survival gear, all in the cramped, pitch-black confines of the tiny capsule.
The recovery teams on the ground were in a frantic race against time. They knew the capsule had come down somewhere in the region of the lake, but the blizzard made finding it almost impossible. The snow was so heavy and the winds so strong that their search and rescue helicopters were grounded. They had to deploy rugged, all-terrain amphibious vehicles to try and search the vast, frozen shoreline. For hours, the two cosmonauts waited in their dark, freezing prison. The capsule's reserve parachute, which was stored in a compartment on the outside, had accidentally deployed on impact with the water. This blocked the porthole window, plunging them into absolute darkness. It also covered the intake for the cabin's air circulation system. With the fans dead and the intake blocked, the oxygen level inside the cabin began to drop, while the carbon dioxide from their own breath steadily built up. They were slowly running out of air. They were cold, isolated, and in very real danger of suffocating despite having safely returned to their home planet. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, a search-and helicopter, flying dangerously low through a brief lull in the blizzard, spotted the capsule's faint emergency beacon. The location was relayed to the ground teams, but the rescue was still far from certain. The surface of the lake was a treacherous, unstable mix of thick ice and slushy open water. The first amphibious vehicles that tried to reach the capsule got stuck in the slush. The rescue helicopters tried to lower cables to drag the capsule, but the high winds made it too dangerous to get close. The entire night passed with the crew trapped, listening to the frustrating sounds of failed rescue attempts just outside their frozen metal shell.
By morning, the situation inside the capsule was critical. The cosmonauts were suffering from the effects of the intense cold and the high levels of carbon dioxide, but they were alive.
As the sun rose, the blizzard finally began to subside, giving the rescue teams a better chance. Finally, a rescue helicopter was able to get low enough and stable enough for a diver to be lowered into the freezing water. The diver managed to attach a steel cable to the Soyuz capsule. The helicopter then began the slow, arduous process of dragging the entire one-ton capsule, with the crew still inside, across the miles of frozen lake to the solid ground of the shoreline. After more than 12 hours trapped in their freezing, oxygen-starved prison, the hatch was finally opened. The two cosmonauts emerged, exhausted and frostbitten, but alive. The story of Soyuz 23 is a powerful, if lesser-known, reminder that for an astronaut, the mission is never over until you are well and truly home. It shows that sometimes the most hostile environment is not the vacuum of space, but the wild, unforgiving elements of our own planet. Now, let's leave these long, drawn-out survival stories behind and move to our final category of quiet terrors. These are the split-second crises, the moments where a mission teetered on the brink of disaster, saved not by days of planning, but by a few seconds of incredible skill or a perfectly designed safety system. Our first story here takes us back to the pioneering days of the Gemini program, to March of 1966, and it involves the very first spaceflight of a man who would later become a global legend for his calm under pressure, Neil Armstrong.
The mission was Gemini 8. Its primary goal was a major milestone in the race to the moon, to perform the first ever docking between two spacecraft in orbit. This was a critical skill that had to be perfected for the future Apollo missions. Armstrong, as the mission commander, and his crewmate David Scott were tasked with piloting their Gemini capsule to rendezvous and physically link up with an uncrewed target vehicle called the Agena target vehicle, which had been launched into orbit just ahead of them. The first part of the mission was flawless. They launched perfectly, successfully chased down the Agena in orbit, and Armstrong, with the steady hand of a master pilot, gently nudged the nose of his Gemini capsule into the docking port on the Agena. He called out, "Flight, we are docked!" For the first time in history, two spacecraft were flying together as one, physically connected high above the Earth. It was a huge triumph for the American space program. But just a few minutes later, as the combined spacecraft drifted over the Indian Ocean, out of radio contact with mission control, things went terribly wrong. The docked vehicles began to unexpectedly spin. At first, it was a slow, gentle roll. The astronauts assumed the problem was with the Agena target vehicle, that perhaps its control system was misfiring. Following their procedures, they used the thrusters on their own Gemini capsule to try and stop the roll. But to their confusion, the spinning just got faster and faster and more violent. They were tumbling end over end in space, out of control, completing a full revolution every single second. The situation had gone from triumphant to critical in a heartbeat.
The intense, disorienting spin was causing the astronauts to experience vertigo. Their vision began to blur. If the spin continued to accelerate, they would eventually black out from the G-forces, a fatal situation. Armstrong made the split-second decision that their only choice
was to undock from the Agena, believing its thrusters were the cause of the problem. He fired the separation mechanism. But as soon as they pushed away from the Agena, the problem got worse. Their own Gemini capsule began to spin even faster. It was now clear that the problem wasn't the Agena at all. One of the 16 thrusters that made up their orbital attitude and maneuvering system, or OAMS, was stuck open. It was firing continuously, like a stuck gas pedal, sending them into this uncontrollable, dizzying tumble. The main thruster system was now the enemy. It could not be used to stop the spin. It was the cause of it. The mission was only a few hours old, but they were literally seconds away from losing consciousness and being lost forever. In that moment of extreme crisis, Neil Armstrong's legendary coolness took over. While tumbling violently, he calmly and methodically diagnosed the problem. He realized he had to shut down the entire OAMS system to stop the rogue thruster. But that would leave them with no way to control their orientation in orbit. However, there was another, completely separate set of thrusters on the spacecraft, the Re-entry Control System, or RCS. These were smaller thrusters located on a different part of the capsule, near its nose. And they were meant to be used for only one purpose: to orient the capsule for the final, fiery descent back to Earth. According to the strict mission rules, the moment an astronaut activated the RCS, the mission was automatically aborted. They had to come home immediately.
With no other choice, Armstrong reached up and flipped the switches to deactivate the main thruster system. The rogue thruster finally went silent. Then, with incredible finesse and skill, while still spinning, he began to use the re-entry thrusters, firing careful, precise counterbursts to fight the rotation. Slowly, painstakingly, he brought the violent spin under control until the capsule was stable again. It was an act of piloting that was almost beyond belief, a stunning display of grace under the most extreme pressure imaginable. His quick thinking and steady hand had undoubtedly saved their lives. But in doing so, he had, by the mission rules, sealed their fate. With the main thrusters deactivated and the re-entry system now partially used, they had to come home. Their ambitious 3-day mission, which was meant to include a long spacewalk by David Scott, was over after just under 11 hours. They made an emergency splashdown in a backup zone in the Pacific Ocean near Okinawa. It was, on paper, a mission failure, but it was also a stunning demonstration of the kind of cool-headed thinking that just a few years later would make Neil Armstrong the perfect choice to handle the immense pressure of manually landing the Eagle on the surface of the Moon. Now, for our final story, let's journey forward in time to the modern era of spaceflight. This is a story from just a few years ago, in 2018. It's a reminder that even with all our advanced computers and decades of experience, space travel is and will always be a fundamentally powerful and dangerous endeavor. But it's also a story that shows how brilliantly our safety systems, born from the lessons of the past, can work. This is the story of Soyuz MS-10. The Soyuz rocket is a legend. It's the most successful and longest-serving launch vehicle in human history. It's a Russian design, a true workhorse that has been launching cosmonauts and astronauts into orbit safely and reliably for over 50 years. On October 11, 2018, a Soyuz rocket stood on the launch pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, ready to carry Russian cosmonaut Alexei Ovchinin and American astronaut Nick Hague on their journey to the International Space Station. The launch began perfectly. The 4 iconic cone-shaped strap-on boosters of the first stage roared to life, and the rocket climbed powerfully into the blue sky. For the first 2 minutes of flight, everything was completely normal. The crew inside the tiny Soyuz capsule at the top of the rocket was being pushed back into their seats by the powerful G-forces, watching their altitude and speed increase on their control panels. Then came the moment for the first stage separation. This is a dramatic event in any Soyuz launch, known as the Korolev cross, where the 4 boosters are meant to peel away from the central core stage like the petals of a flower. But on this day, something went wrong. A sensor that was supposed to trigger the proper opening of a valve on one of the boosters had been damaged during the rocket's assembly on the ground. Because of this single bent sensor, one of the 4 boosters failed to separate cleanly from the core stage. It separated at the bottom, but the top remained briefly attached, causing it to slam back into the side of the rocket's central core. This impact sent the entire rocket into an immediate, unstable flight. The crew inside felt a violent jolt and saw the emergency lights flash. Their rocket was failing beneath them.
In a situation like this, happening at an altitude of 50 kilometers and a speed of thousands of kilometers per hour, there is no time for a human to react. There is no time for mission control to analyze the problem and send up a command. The solution has to be instantaneous, automatic, and brutally effective. And for the Soyuz, that solution is a remarkable piece of engineering called the Launch Abort System, or SAS. This system is essentially a small but incredibly powerful solid rocket motor that sits on a tower on the very top of the spacecraft, above the crew capsule. For the entire ascent through the atmosphere, this system is armed and ready. Its own set of sensors constantly monitors the main rocket's performance. If those sensors detect any kind of catastrophic failure, like a sudden loss of thrust, a fire, or a dangerous, uncontrolled tumble like the one they were now in, it fires automatically. And that's exactly what happened for the crew of Soyuz MS-10. The moment the rocket went off course, the escape system's computers detected the anomaly. In a fraction of a second, it fired. With a violent, explosive jolt, the abort motors ignited, ripping the entire top section of the rocket, with the crew capsule attached, completely away from the top of the failing booster stack. The crew was pulled up and away from the danger with incredible force. The experience for the astronauts inside was intense. They were subjected to G-forces of over 6 times their normal body weight, as their small capsule was blasted away from the disintegrating rocket. They were on a wild but safe ride. Their mission to orbit was over,
but their journey back to Earth had just begun. After being thrown clear, their capsule followed a steep but survivable ballistic trajectory back down towards the ground.
The capsule's own systems then worked perfectly. It separated from the abort tower, and its parachutes deployed as planned, slowing their steep descent. They came down for a safe, if rather bumpy, landing on the remote, flat steppe of Kazakhstan. A recovery team in helicopters, which had been tracking their trajectory, reached them shortly after they touched down. They were shaken and had certainly experienced some intense forces, but they were completely unharmed. The mission had failed to reach orbit, but in the world of human spaceflight, this event was considered a spectacular success. A catastrophic rocket failure during the most dynamic phase of launch is one of the most dangerous scenarios imaginable. And the Soyuz MS-10 crew had walked away without a scratch. It was a powerful, real-world demonstration of a safety system working exactly as it was designed to, a system built on decades of experience and lessons learned from past tragedies. It's a quiet reminder that while we can't make spaceflight perfectly safe, we can make it survivable by planning for things to go wrong. And so our quiet journey through these incredible stories of being stuck in space comes to an end. We have drifted through some of the most challenging and perilous moments in the history of exploration. We sat with Sergei Krikalev, a man left adrift by the currents of history itself, a quiet testament to personal endurance. We rode along in the cold, dark lifeboat of Apollo 13, witnessing the brilliant, calm ingenuity of a crew and a mission control team inventing solutions on the fly. We waited in the freezing, dark capsule of Soyuz 23, a reminder that the dangers don't end when you've landed. And we felt the violent, split-second crises of Gemini 8 and Soyuz MS-10, moments where disaster was averted by incredible skill or a perfectly executed safety plan.
Each of these stories, in its own way, is about being stuck. Stuck in orbit, stuck in a broken ship, stuck in a frozen lake, stuck in a deadly spin. But what I find so beautiful and so calming about them is that they are not, in the end, stories about being stuck. They are stories about getting free. They are about problem solving. They are about the quiet courage of facing an impossible situation and methodically, calmly working the problem, one step at a time, until a solution is found. These tales are not really about the failures of technology, but about the incredible triumphs of the human mind, of teamwork, of training, and of our deep, unshakable instinct to survive and to bring our people home. These events are the exceptions, not the rule. For every one of these dramatic tales, there are thousands upon thousands of hours of quiet, routine, successful work being done in space. But it is in these moments of crisis that we see the true character of the entire endeavor. Space will always be an unforgiving environment. It will always hold the potential for sudden, new, and unforeseen problems. And these stories teach us that the most important tool we can send into that environment is not a more powerful rocket or a more advanced computer, but a well-trained, resilient, and resourceful human mind. So as you settle into your final moments before sleep, let these stories rest gently in your thoughts. Don't think of the danger, but of the calm in the face of it.
Think of the quiet voices on the radio, methodically working the problem. Think of the teams of engineers on the ground, united in a single purpose. Think of the courage it takes to not just venture into the great, silent void, but to do so knowing that the journey home is never guaranteed. It is a quiet form of heroism, and it is deeply inspiring. Sweet dreams.